little skeletons. I've got some big news. Weird True Crime is now available ad-free on both Patreon and Apple Podcasts. For just $3 a month, you can say goodbye to ads and enjoy uninterrupted listening. But wait, there's more. For $5 a month, you can join our Discord group, the Chaos Corner Skeletons, and hang out with fellow true crime fans just like you. And if you're feeling extra spooky, become an Ultimate Skelly for $10 a month on Patreon to get access to unfiltered, mostly unedited video episodes. As a big thank you, we will give you a special shout out on the show. Thanks for keeping it weird and supporting us. Bye.
Darkcast Network, indie pods with a dark side.
Welcome back. If you've already listened to part 1 of this case, then you know Ryan Waller and Heather Kwan's story is as tragic as it is infuriating. In the first episode, we walked you through their lives before the crime, the events leading up to that Christmas night in 2006, and the heartbreaking aftermath for Ryan, Heather, and their families. We also touched on some of the shocking missteps by the Phoenix Police Department, and trust us, there's plenty more where that came from.
Today, we're diving into the next chapter of this story, the trial of Richie and Larry Carver. This part of the case reveals just how messy and frustrating the pursuit of justice for Ryan and Heather really became. I'm Gina.
And I'm Amber.
And this is part 2 of the real story of what happened to Ryan Waller and Heather Kwan.
Before we dive into more details about the trial itself, we need to address the ongoing confusion about when the crime actually happened. Why does this matter? Because the date used during the trial was wrong. Crazy, right? Remember how Heather's official day of death was changed from December 25th to December 23rd, about a month and a half after the initial report? Well, the trial ran with that revised date. All the court and appeals documents list the crime as happening on December 23rd, 2006. If that's not strange enough, the prosecution's main witness, Cheryl Carver, said in her statement that Larry and Richie went to Ryan's house between 8 and 9 p.m. on December 23rd. Yeah, we didn't see that coming either.
According to Dawn, the Wallers investigators believe Cheryl was manipulated by the Phoenix Police Department into changing the date to match Heather's revised day of death on the autopsy report. Why? To deflect the blame from the department for failing to get Ryan medical help in a timely manner. Now, here's the thing. Much of Cheryl's statement did match the crime scene details. She knew Ryan was shot in the kitchen and Heather was killed on the couch. But other parts? They don't add up. Cheryl claimed that Larry fled to California the night of December 23rd and was back home in time for Christmas morning. She even said the Carvers had Christmas brunch at Denny's like one big happy family.
Let's pause there for a second. How does that timeline make sense when we know Larry didn't come back from California until sometime after the crime? In fact, he was still out of state when Richie was arrested in early February. What's more plausible is that the Carvers had brunch at Denny's on Christmas morning before Richie and Larry decided to commit the murder and leave Ryan permanently injured. You might be thinking, why would the police department go through all this trouble to change the date of the crime? Maybe it really did happen on the 23rd. But let's not forget a few key details. Heather's friend Christina said in an interview that she saw Heather alive on Christmas Eve. Cheryl gave her witness statement right around the time Heather's day of death was changed. And most importantly, Ryan always maintained that the crime happened on Christmas Day.
Think about it. Ryan had nothing to gain by saying he was shot on the 25th instead of the 23rd. Even during Richie and Larry's trial, he testified that it occurred on Christmas Day. So if Ryan, the victim who survived the attack, always said it was the 25th, why would anyone believe otherwise? And if none of those facts drive home just how far the Phoenix Police Department was willing to go to cover their asses and completely dismiss what they did to Ryan, listen to Don share how he and Ryan were treated by Detective Dalton on the first day of the trial.
The very first day of the murder trial for Richie, when we got there, we were in the very first row, and literally there's a 30-inch pulling wall and 8 feet between us and Richie. And I'm in the very first seat, Ryan's in the middle seat, and then Keller's mom, Terry, is in the third seat. And we're all there getting ready for the trial start. Well, the detective that did the interrogation, not the detective that took over, he comes into the courtroom, and I haven't seen him at all, but he comes up and he steps in front of me, in front of Ryan, and reaches around and says, "Good morning, Mrs. Potter, Terry." He says, "How are you doing today?" And he's talking to her, and then steps back in front of us and walks away. And then I'm just I'm thinking, my God, this is the kid that you accused of murder that had a hole in his brain, had a broken jaw, and we can talk about that, how they a broken jaw, but he had a fractured skull, had 6 pieces of his eye socket up in his brain, and a second shot to the side of the head, and you can't even say, "Hey, buddy, how you doing?" Or, nothing. He did not even acknowledge us, and it was so hard for me not to actually get physically aggressive towards him. But at that time, I'm thinking, right now we're on the same, team. Right now, we have to worry about getting this Richie guy thrown in prison. Then we'll deal with this, later. But I'm not letting that go away.
Wow.
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
Like, if they had nothing to hide, if he did nothing wrong and they weren't trying to cover their asses, why would Dalton go out of his way to step past them, completely ignore him, not just pretend like he wasn't there? This poor kid that he interrogated that had a bullet in his brain. You can't even say hi?
Oh my God.
If that doesn't show guilt, I don't know what does.
It really.
Yeah. And that's how Don feels about it too.
Now that we've gone down that rabbit hole, let's get back to the facts of the trial. The prosecution didn't have the murder weapon, but they had plenty of witness testimony and Richie's connection to the house to tie him to the crime. Larry, however, had a potential wild card on his side, Cheryl Carver. Despite her detailed statement implicating Richie and Larry, even if the date was wrong, when it came time to testify, Cheryl took the stand and said she did not remember making those statements and/or lied to the detectives because her relationship with Larry was rocky and she wanted to be rid of him.
According to court documents, the court found that Cheryl's loss of memory was not genuine but feigned. In other words, the consensus was that Cheryl invoked spousal privilege and refused to testify against Larry because she was terrified of him. Don shared that he doesn't fault her for recanting her statement. He actually felt bad for her and the impossible position she was in. Think about it. Here's a mother testifying against her son, who's on trial for murder, while being married to a man who was more than willing to throw his own son under the bus to save himself. And in Cheryl's original statement, she said that Larry shot Ryan and Heather. However, Ryan testified that Richie was the one who shot him. So while Cheryl clearly knew a lot of details about what happened that night, she lied about who pulled the trigger. Why? To take some of the heat off of Richie and place more of the blame on Larry. You can't really blame her for doing this. This woman had been assaulted and abused for years. getting on the stand to put more of the blame on her violent husband would have only put her at greater risk. And I think she knew that, and Dawn knows that too.
Oh yeah, for sure. This was a huge blow for the prosecution. Without Cheryl's testimony, their case against Larry was much weaker. However, a friend of Cheryl's who was present during her original statement and the detectives who took the statement testified about what was said. Despite this, Larry's defense seized on Ryan's brain injury to challenge his credibility. And this is when the infamous interrogation video comes into play. During the trial, the defense played Ryan's interrogation video, the one recorded while he had a bullet lodged in his brain. And get this, Dawn didn't even know Ryan was interrogated until the video was played in court. And seeing it for the first time was devastating. I mean, it has made a lasting impression on me to this day still. And that wasn't even my son.
You know how I found out about the interrogation? A year and a half later, during the murder trial, the defense attorney plays it because he wanted the jury to see how scrambled Ryan's brain was, and that this guy does say these guys did it, but he says everything else happened. So he was trying to create a shadow of doubt in their minds about, hey, this kid, maybe he did see this in the first day, and his brain is so messed up that he thinks these guys are the ones that came back and shot him.
And the morning of the 26th, there is an interview that Dawn did with local media outside of the hospital talking about what happened. And at that time, he had no idea that Ryan was being treated as a suspect or that he had been interrogated or that all these mugshots had been taken of him. And he told me that if he had known that at that time, he would have had a very different
100%
reaction, emotions during that. I just the infuriating feelings you would have sitting in that courtroom, seeing this for the first time and being like, what the hell do you mean my son was investigated that night? I thought he went from the cop car to the hospital.
That's what you would think, right?
Right.
I can't imagine watching how Ryan struggled, how visibly uncomfortable he was, how disoriented he was. That Dawn knew his son. Dawn knew that there was something very, very clearly wrong with him, with how he was moving, the things that he was doing, and how he was talking. To see that for the first time in a trial, I can't even imagine.
It's like waking up and getting the news that your son's in the ICU all over again.
Yeah.
Just devastating. Yeah.
As I mentioned about the interrogation video, we covered it in detail during our first episode that was replayed on January 1st. So if you're not familiar with it, now's the time to hit pause, go listen to last week's replay, and then come back. We'll wait. No problem. Okay, now that you're all caught up, let's dig into it again. Because with more insight from Dawn, things get even more frustrating. In the video, Ryan is visibly confused. Remember, he literally had a bullet in his brain. But even in that state, he clearly says that Richie and Larry came to the house on Christmas Day and shot him and Heather. At first, he says they used arrows before correcting himself to say a revolver. Detective Dalton even asks Ryan why someone would come over and do something like this on Christmas Day. He had more proof the shooting occurred on the 25th. Here's the question, though. If Ryan told the detectives that night who shot him, why weren't Richie and Larry arrested sooner?
You saw during the interrogation, Ryan does say this guy Richie and his dad came and did it. They never ever investigated who this guy Richie might be. Or that they could have went and got an APS bill from the house and saw that the last APS, which is Arizona Power Service electric bill, they could have gotten and said, hey, this guy Richie used to live in the house. Let's check his record. All this guy already spent 4 years in prison for stabbing somebody when he was 17 years old. maybe there is something to this kid's story. They never investigated this guy, Richie, his dad, when Ryan had told them that. Never did anything at all.
They never did anything at all.
Because they were so set on pinning Ryan that they didn't care. They did not care.
We found this kid alone in this house with his dead girlfriend. It's always the significant other.
Yeah.
No, it's not. A lot of the time, yes, but no, it's not always.
He sat here and said it was Richie Carver and his dad. And so they spent the next day and a half tearing up Ryan's house, looking for a weapon that wasn't even there.
Yep.
Because he told them who did it. But they didn't care.
They just didn't want to believe him. I mean, so you don't want to use the credibility of a kid who got shot in the face and had to endure hours of sitting and waiting and an hour-long interrogation with a bullet in his face.
No, he must be lying.
But you don't want to believe him. Yeah, he's not telling. He can't possibly be saying anything accurate at all.
No. I know, it's infuriating. The entire 40-something days Ryan spent in the hospital in rehab, he was still being treated as the main suspect, like we said. And like we said, remember how detectives tore apart Ryan's house looking for a murder weapon that didn't exist? According to Dawn, the investigator also shared that the police were working off a theory that the shooting was a murder-suicide gone wrong. And this is another part of the interview. It was recorded when the investigator came to Dawn's house once Ryan was back home. The entire interview was recorded. This section of the investigator saying that they were looking at it as a murder-suicide gone wrong, and the section about them tearing apart Ryan's house looking for a weapon was deleted.
Oh, that's
from the video. So convenient. And they were working off of this murder-suicide theory despite the fact that Ryan had already told Detective Dalton during his interrogation while still having a bullet in his brain.
I don't think that we can stress that
right
enough. He sat there.
He was a victim.
With a bullet in his brain and clearly visibly injured on his face.
Saying, this is what happened. Saying that Richie and Larry were responsible. But instead of investigating that lead, they stayed laser focused on proving their original theory. It wasn't until almost a month and a half later, after Ryan was back home and still saying that Richie and Larry shot him and Heather, that they finally started to take him seriously.
So let's talk a little more about their original theory. The cops are certain that they walked into a simple murder-suicide attempt that Christmas night. During the interrogation video, Detective Dalton tells Ryan he heard there are a lot of guns in his house. This is a leading question. Dalton is trying to get Ryan to say he owned guns. Ryan responds with, and Dalton replies, "You know we're going to check." Ryan gives a non-committal, as in, yes, I know you'll check, not, yes, I have guns in the house.
Dawn shared that after searching the house and coming up short, Dalton wrote in his reports that Richie and Larry must have taken all of the guns. But there were no guns to find. As we mentioned earlier, Ryan only had one antique gun that belonged to his grandfather, and he kept it packed away. And if I cannot tell you the number of men I know that have antique guns that belong to their grandfathers stored somewhere in their house, doesn't mean they own a lot of guns. Ryan didn't even mention anything about it, probably because it's just something he had from his grandfather.
It's more of a nostalgic memorabilia piece. Yes, it's a keepsake. It's not something that they regularly use and fire and
Correct. While the defense may have used this interrogation video to attack Ryan's credibility, it didn't work for Richie. The jury found Richie guilty on all counts, and he was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole.
Larry, on the other hand, wasn't so easy to convict. Without Cheryl's testimony, and with the defense casting doubt on Ryan's memory, the jury didn't have enough to convict Larry. He was acquitted and released, which was a devastating blow for Ryan's family.
It was just upsetting to us to know that they let this guy out without any prejudice. He didn't have to check in with anybody. He didn't have to stay away from us, nothing at all. And so that was the hardest part. And it took us 6 years to get him prosecuted. We went through 3 murder trials with him.
Larry may have been acquitted, but Heather's family fought back in a big way.
After Larry's acquittal in the first trial, Heather's family appealed to the Arizona legislature to make sure something like this couldn't happen again. Their push led to the creation of Heather's Law. According to the Maricopa County Attorney's Office, this law amended the marital privilege statute, making it possible to force a defendant's spouse to testify against them. It was a huge step forward for victims and their families, and it would play a critical role in Larry's case. A year and a half after the first trial and the inaction of Heather's Law, Larry was arrested again. It seemed like justice might finally be served, but of course, Larry's attorneys had a loophole. They argued that Heather's Law didn't include language making it retroactive. Essentially, because Cheryl had already invoked her marital privilege during the first trial, they claimed she couldn't be forced to testify under the new law. Unfortunately, Larry's defense won that appeal, and he was released again.
But Heather's family weren't about to give up. They appealed the judge's decision and won, reigniting the battle over whether Heather's Law could be applied retroactively in Larry's case. After a hard-fought legal process, the court ultimately ruled in favor of the state. With that victory, Larry Carver was re-indicted in November 2011 for first-degree murder, attempted first-degree murder, burglary, and aggravated assault. This time, the trial was airtight. After 10 days in court and 2.5 days of jury deliberation, Larry was found guilty on all counts. In January 2013, Larry was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Good riddance.
Good riddance indeed. And big props to Heather's family for not just stepping aside once he got acquitted the first time. It's like, no, we're going to figure out how to get this asshole in prison. And they did. And they did not give up until they did.
This is what Heather wanted to do with her life. So they, in a way, still allowed Heather to make that difference that she wanted to help people even after her death.
I hadn't even thought about it that way.
Oh, I'm sorry.
You're so right, though. You're so right, though. They kept her legacy alive by continuing to fight for her because it's what she would have done.
That's what she wanted. That's what she would have done. So
100%.
Even though she wasn't able to fulfill it in person to do it, she still has made a huge difference in helping people and an impact on future victims' lives.
Absolutely. And while Heather's family was fighting to put Larry Carver behind bars, the Wallers were fighting for accountability, a battle that lasted 3.5 years as they worked to build a lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department for mishandling Ryan and Heather's case. They were suing for $15 million, and the evidence they collected was staggering. The Wallers got their hands on police records, witness statements, depositions, Heather's autopsy, basically everything they could to show just how badly this case had been botched. And we got our hands on a lot of this documentation thanks to Dawn, and it's black and white.
It's
black and white. As part of the lawsuit prep, Ryan was deposed. Dawn shared that during the deposition, Ryan was asked a barrage of questions. Whether he told officers on the scene he'd been shot, whether his parents knew, if he received medical attention, and what he remembered from that night. These questions weren't just repetitive, they were cruel. Dawn said the line of questioning was designed to trigger Ryan's frustration, which, thanks to his frontal lobe damage, made him easily agitated.
It wasn't just the deposition that painted a damning picture of the police response. Part of the findings included a report written by Officer Christy Stevenson from the night of the shooting. According to the report, when officers entered the house after gaining access through a locksmith, they gave Ryan commands to keep his hands up and lay on the ground. But Ryan, severely injured with a bullet in his brain, we are not going to stop saying it, didn't follow the commands. Instead, he kept asking, "What's going on?" The report states that Ryan tucked his arms under his body after Officer Stevenson guided him to the ground. Officer Stevenson then utilized a pressure point to the left side underneath the subject's jaw to retrieve his arm. For those unfamiliar, this pain compliance technique is supposed to involve applying pressure toward the neck and forward to the opposite eye to encourage movement.
But Don shared that this isn't what happened. According to Ryan, he was tackled to the ground, pinning his arms beneath him. When your arms are pinned beneath you, you can't really bring them behind your body like they're telling you to. So this is when the officer applied the pressure point technique, causing Ryan's jaw to snap. The result? Ryan's jaw was permanently damaged. Medical reports confirmed the break wasn't related to the gunshot wound, and the Wallers believe the pressure point technique caused it.
Ryan, it wasn't bad enough getting his jaw broken, but he had permanent injuries from that. He had what's called TMJ, where his jaw is almost locked. He couldn't open his mouth more than a half of an inch. Everything for the rest of his life had to be smushed down small enough to fit between the small opening in his teeth to get into his mouth to be able to eat. So that was a permanent injury that they caused on him, and we have the report to show that. And everything coincides with his injuries about what the officer says about using this technique on his left jaw, and the fact that Ryan's left jaw is broken. That just shows us. So we have all this evidence to show that they were negligent, they were corrupt, and never got one day in court.
So a side note on pressure points, they should be used on someone who is actively resisting and should not be used on passive resistors.
So like a guy that's like sitting there struggling with his arms and trying to
Fighting.
pull and fight away, then that would be applied because that pain is going to make them stop.
Correct.
Ryan was never combative or aggressive.
He had no idea what was going
fighting.
on.
He was confused. He was just laying there. And of course, his arms were pinned because they tackled him to the ground, and body weight on top of your arms, you can't freaking move them
and he's
matter
got a
what.
cop on top of his back. Like, how is he supposed to get his arms out from under him to put them behind his back? Especially when he's severely injured already. And it's not common for the jaw to be broken due to this technique. Excessive force or improper training can lead to this outcome.
Yep. And yet, after all this evidence, the Wallers case never even made it to trial. 3 weeks before it was set to begin, the judge dismissed it. The judge, coincidentally, was the next to retire from the state circuit of judges. The dismissal was based on the testimony of a state witness who claimed the 6-hour delay in getting Ryan medical attention had no impact on his injuries. This decision directly contradicted the Wallers' expert witness, a brain surgeon from Florida who was prepared to testify to the severe consequences of that delay. According to the Wallers' witness, every minute your brain is bleeding, it's swelling. Every minute your brain is swelling, damage is being caused. Of course, 6 hours makes a difference. Amen.
Right. And remember, they're trying to say that 6 hours doesn't make a difference when he had already been in that position for 2 days, because they're trying to say it happened on the 23rd.
Yes. Yep.
Right.
They're trying to put as much time
between
to displace as much blame as they possibly
there's no
can.
way our delay had anything to do with how severe his injuries were. That's not us. Don has been very open about his belief that the judge was bribed to dismiss the case. Considering everything we've learned, it's hard not to share his frustration. Like, this guy was retiring in a month and a half. He had nothing to lose. Sure, I'll take some money to dismiss this case for you so you guys don't have to worry about it. Not to mention, there have been so many experts that have looked at this case and said, absolutely, sitting in that car for that long made a difference in the swelling and the infection in his brain. So, and this is something that Don and I talked about. Who did they bribe? What did they give this guy to get on the stand, or like to say, oh yeah, that wouldn't have made any sort of difference? No one in their right mind who was a legit doctor would say that.
No.
Without getting something in return for it. While the Wallers technically had the option to appeal the dismissal, Don shared that the odds were stacked against them. Their attorney had already invested a significant amount of his own money into the case, and the Phoenix Police Department had an entire team of attorneys backing them. If the Wallers were to win an appeal, but then lose in court, they would have been responsible for covering all of the police department's legal fees, a financial risk they just simply couldn't afford. Knowing the police department was willing to do whatever it took to dismiss the case or secure a win, pursuing an appeal just wasn't feasible.
And that's unfortunate. It makes complete sense. It's absolutely unfortunate, but whenever you're going up against giants like a police department with all the backing and everything, like you, what can you do?
Don told me when we were talking about this that they went to their law offices and he expected it to just be like one office on this floor of this office building, like downtown. No, it was the entire floor.
Oh, yeah.
Like, and it was so, you could tell that this law office had money to burn. Like, they were screwed. There was nothing they could do once it got dismissed.
Yeah. After the shooting, Ryan's life was marked by daily struggles and heartbreaking challenges. According to Don, Ryan was never the same person. He had more bad days than good, and his quality of life was severely diminished. His short-term memory was horrible. He would often repeat himself, ask the same question over and over, or even forget something he'd just done. On top of that, he was easily agitated, a common side effect of his brain injury. The seizures Ryan endured were among the most devastating effects of his injuries. Don described them as frequent and severe, often resulting in serious injuries. Ryan bit off the side of his tongue, broke his ankle, and suffered deep cuts and scrapes when he had seizures outside on gravel. One of the worst incidents occurred in a grocery store where Ryan had a seizure that left him needing 40 stitches on his face and head.
Don shared photos of Ryan's face after the seizure and asked us to share them with you to help people truly understand just how much Ryan's life was impacted after the shooting. You'll find them on our socials website and YouTube channel. In addition to the violent seizures, which occurred every few weeks, Ryan experienced daily drop seizures. These caused him to go limp and collapse briefly, adding yet another layer of risk and fear to his daily life. Don and his family believed that Ryan was the victim of not one, but 3 horrible crimes: the shooting, the negligence during the interrogation and delay in medical care, and the dismissal of his case. When asked about what life was like for the rest of the family during this time, Don shared this deeply emotional reflection.
Well, it was really hard. It was heartbreaking, especially for his parents, because you try to think of positive things, but you couldn't look at them without seeing the bullet holes on his face, so that was always there. You couldn't look at him without seeing they cut his head from here to here to get into his brain. You couldn't look at him without seeing that scar. So just looking at him, you were constantly reminded of that. But just as sad and depressed as he was getting, being 18 years old and knowing that you would never be able to drive a car, you would never have a job because no one's going to hire somebody that has seizures and that. It was depressing for him. And then have your girlfriend murdered in front of you. It was horrible. And then for me to know that, I just knew that he wasn't going to live a long life. And I just always knew that his life was going to end sooner than it should have. And it was just horrible. And then medications that he was on for the rest of his life, he would have eventually been blind completely when this medication was on. He would have needed to go on dialysis. He just didn't have a good future at all. There was just no quality of life in his future at all that could have had.
Sadly, Ryan's life came to a tragic end on January 20th, 2016. He passed away as a result of one of his seizures, leaving behind a family forever changed by the events that had unfolded. Even now, years after Ryan's death, the Wallers are still hoping their lawsuit against the Phoenix Police Department will make it to court. They aren't after monetary compensation. They just want their day in court, a chance to let a jury hear the facts and decide for themselves. According to Dawn, the Phoenix Police Department conducted an internal investigation after the shooting and concluded they had done nothing wrong. Detective Paul Dalton, who interrogated Ryan for hours while he had a bullet in his brain, faced no disciplinary action and continued his career until retirement. In fact, Dawn shared that Dalton went on to teach detective techniques at one of the local colleges. I'm sorry, he's the first detective who saw Ryan face to face for over an hour in that interrogation room. And it wasn't until an hour later that, after staring at this poor boy's face, decided to finally get him medical treatment.
And we've heard the interrogation video. He even says at that point, if you look, you can see the entry and exit wound. You were looking at his face for an hour.
I've said it so many times. I don't care if you are a serial killer, you're whoever. It is the police department's responsibility to get medical treatment for their suspect before they interrogate, to make sure that they are fit.
It doesn't matter if Ryan was the one who did it. He still needed medical attention. And Dawn said the same thing. It doesn't matter. It doesn't matter who you are or what you did. If you are injured, it is their responsibility to help first, ask questions later.
Yep. And they did not. They clearly did not.
No, absolutely not. A couple of years ago, 2 investigators from the Department of Justice visited the Wallers to discuss the Phoenix Police Department's mishandling of the case. While an investigation into the city of Phoenix and its police department was conducted, Ryan's case wasn't mentioned in the report. It was yet another painful reminder of how the system had failed Ryan and his family. Dawn also spoke about the guilt he carried for years after that night, wondering if he could have done something more to help Ryan.
Oh, and this quote fucking kills me.
Right. And for years, I lived with the guilt of knowing that when I was knocking on that door, just 10 feet down the other side, lay one dead person and one critically injured person. Knowing that when I first was there, I thought, I'll kick the door in, but then I go through my mind, I say, you know what? You're going to kick the door open and find out he's not home and get your son evicted from his first home because you're being the helicopter dad, just overreacting. And so I always had that guilty feeling that I didn't kick the door open, because we would have had a lot better results than by what they did, because I would have went in there and saw him and called the paramedics before I called the police. But I had that guilt. But then a couple of years ago, I was thinking deeply into it, and I actually now I'm relieved that I didn't go into that house, because had I gone into that house and took the door open, the police would have came and said, Mr. Waller, you took that gun and you disposed of that gun that your son used to murder that girl. Now you're going to prison for being an accomplice or for hiding evidence. And I feel that that's probably what would have happened. They probably would have said, hey, we know he shot him, but what, you did something with the gun, so you're involved now. And so that's the way that I can try to find peace, is to know that, hey, I probably, would have been a suspect and in prison along with Ryan, as trying to protect my own son. So I try to find comfort in that, knowing that, maybe I can do the right thing by not taking it at all.
I completely see where he's coming from, 100%. As a mom, you'd think you're going to do everything in your power to help your child to get to them, but he's right.
He's right.
With how things played out, 100% shit would have been turned and flipped around on both of them.
Absolutely. And it breaks my heart that he's lived with this guilt for so long, and he had to justify his actions like this. And yes. I told him, I was like, I understand the feelings of guilt. That's completely natural. It is not your fault. You had no idea what was going on the other side of that door.
The police also didn't do their job and...
Correct. Or show up in any sort of timely fashion at all. And so the fact that he has to sit here and justify his guilt, saying, well, if I had gone in, I'd probably be in jail. And he's not wrong.
No, he's not. That's the sad part about it.
No.
He shouldn't have to justify that at all, though.
No, he shouldn't.
Despite everything, Don is determined to keep Ryan's story alive, and so are we. He hopes that by sharing what happened, media pressure will force the Phoenix Police Department to finally take responsibility for their actions. In June 2023, just a couple of weeks before our first episode about Ryan's story, Larry Carver died in prison. In a Facebook post, Don shared his completely understandable reaction. Quote, I am excited to say that one of the two men who murdered Ryan and Heather has finished serving his life sentence. Larry Carver rotted away like the piece of garbage he was. Now he has met his maker. End quote. And I remember sharing that quote in the first episode as well.
Yeah, you did. And I felt like it was so pointed and honest, and everybody who knows the story can agree with that. It was like, we've got to share that again, because he is a freaking piece of garbage and he got what he deserved. 100%. Every Christmas, the Wallers decorate Ryan's gravesite. See, now I read all the quotes and now I'm all emotional. Okay. Every Christmas, the Wallers decorate Ryan's gravesite, honoring his favorite holiday. For them, it's a way of making sure he never misses another Christmas. They honored the tradition again this past Christmas. Don shared a beautiful picture of the family with Ryan, surrounded by beautiful decorations and presents, and we'll post that for everyone to see.
And that's where we'll leave Ryan's story for now. This case is heartbreaking on so many levels, and honestly, it's one of those stories that stays with you. There's so much to reflect on. The failures of the system, the resilience of the Waller family, and most importantly, Ryan and Heather's lives, which were forever changed and cut short by violence. We want to take a moment to thank Don Waller for sharing his story with us. Don has been so open about everything his family has been through, and he's passionate about keeping Ryan's story alive. He hopes that by continuing to tell Ryan's story, we can help put pressure on the Phoenix Police Department to finally take accountability for their actions, as we said before.
And we'd love to hear your thoughts on this case. This is one that a lot of people have very strong opinions about. So do you think justice has truly been served? And are you as frustrated with the handling of this case as we are? I feel like I probably know the answer, but I would love to hear your thoughts on this. So let us know on social media. And speaking of, be sure to follow us on our platforms where we'll be sharing never before seen photos of Ryan. And these images show just how much he endured after the shooting and so many wonderful pictures of his life before the shooting.
And Heather.
And the sweet baby pictures and
those killed me.
I know. He's just so cute. And they're an important part of understanding his story. And if you enjoyed this episode or found it meaningful, please take a moment to leave us a 5-star rating and a review. It really helps us keep bringing you these stories.
Also, keep an eye out for the video version of this episode. It's coming soon. If you want to support the show and enjoy ad-free episodes, consider subscribing to us on Patreon or Apple Podcasts. Your support means the world to us and helps us continue to tell stories like this one. Thank you for spending your time with us today, for helping keep Ryan and Heather's stories alive, and for supporting Dawn's mission to make sure the truth is told.
Until next time, stay safe.
And make good choices. Bye.
Bye.